Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Spratt from Sports Info Solutions, joined as always by Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders. And I want to remind everyone that the Off the Charts Football Podcast is presented to you by FantasyInsiders.com, your source for daily fantasy sports content. Their slogan is Accuracy Matters, and it shows as they've won the daily fantasy accuracy competition for the past 3 seasons. If you're serious about DFS or want to become serious, check out FantasyInsiders.com for free educational content and their premium membership options. You know, Aaron, because of what's been going on this season, I feel like recent weeks we've focused on teams that have been undefeated. You know, a lot of teams have lasted a lot longer than in many other seasons. And today we're going to go a little bit the other direction and talk about some other teams that haven't had as much success, or really that they're just not in sync with their DVOA numbers and their overall record. And I think that conversation really has to start with the Minnesota Vikings. You know, with the Packers' third straight loss, this one the most surprising being to the Lions, the Vikings find themselves in first place in the NFC North, and that's been very surprising. But one thing that we've talked about a little bit over the last few weeks is that despite their overall really successful record, they haven't been very successful in DVOA. And even after another big win this week, they're just at 19th in DVOA. So I think there are a lot of things to talk about here. But let's talk first about their schedule, because the real story of the first half of the season for them was how easy their schedule was. But now their last 2 wins have been over the Rams and Raiders, 2 pretty good teams. Does the fact that they've got those wins under their belt sort of change the idea that their schedule so far is a lot easier than their schedule to come?
No, it doesn't at all, actually. Excuse me. Yeah, you know, the funny thing about saying we're going to talk about teams that aren't quite as good is that we start with the team that's doing really, really well, at least when it comes to wins and losses. But yeah, our numbers at Football Outsiders, and for those who might be first-time listeners to the podcast, the 1 or 2 people who might be listening for the first time and are not regular readers, DVOA, of course, is Football Outsiders' main stat that breaks down every play and compares it to the NFL baseline based on the situation and the opponent. And opponent is really important here because of the easy schedule that the Vikings have played so far. And there's no question that the Vikings have played their, 2 of their tougher opponents in the last couple weeks. But first of all, I mean, Oakland and the Rams are not really good teams. Oakland seems to be a good team. The Rams are an average and very inconsistent team. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't change the fact that the Vikings' past schedule is still 31st in the league in average DVOA of opponent, and their upcoming schedule is first in the league in average DVOA of opponent because they've got coming up the Packers twice, who we still have rated better than them, even though the Packers are a game behind, and Seattle, and Arizona, and the surprisingly frisky New York Giants, and the team that is sort of their mirror image, only without the good press, the Atlanta Falcons.
For sure. And so they have 7 total games remaining, and the only team the Vikings face coming up that is worse than them in DVOA is the Chicago Bears. And even they haven't looked terrible of late. So I think you can totally see why the DVOA of their opponents, it sort of syncs up with what you see with the teams coming up here. So with that, obviously the Vikings have a tough road ahead of them, but again, they play the Packers twice. So in a way, they're in control of their own destiny. But I think there's a lot more to the difference in the Vikings' actual success so far this season and their DVOA than just strength of schedule. So let's talk about a couple of the other factors that come into play here. First, has their Week 1 drubbing at the face of the worst DVOA team, the 49ers, made any more sense to you as the season has gone along?
No, that game makes no sense. That is probably the strangest result of the entire season, given what we know about those teams since then. The Tampa Bay Tennessee game from Week 1 is even bigger, but I don't think Tampa Bay's looked better since then, but not that great. And one of the reasons why Tennessee has struggled at times since then is because they had their backup quarterback, and there's a big difference between Mariota and Mettenberger this season. So that result is not as weird as Minnesota losing to San Francisco by a lot, 20-3. So when you take that game out, so first of all, Minnesota, the last 2 games, has played well. The game against Oakland this week was their highest single game rating of the year.
Yeah.
So they've gone from 27th to 19th with these last two wins. So, like, these last two wins, there's no arguing with these last two wins. The argument is about previous games, not these last two. But if you take out that week one loss, they go from 19th to 15th. And then if you take out the opponent adjustments, they go from 15th to 13th. So now they're starting to look a little bit more like what conventional wisdom says that they are. Not necessarily in line with the 7-2 record, but a little bit more in line with conventional wisdom.
So that all makes sense. But, if I'm an average person listening to this for the first time and I'm like, well, I mean, the Vikings are still, 7-2? Like, how, if you ignore the fact that they've had an easy schedule so far this season, and you throw out the game that makes no sense versus the 49ers, how are they still only middle of the pack in rating? And I think the answer, it's sort of some of the luck elements of the game, right?
Right. They've had good luck as far as a couple of things. One is something we, don't talk about a lot, but it's sort of order of plays. Like their plays have been put together in such a way that they have scored. I know that sounds weird to say that that's a bad thing. It's not that that's a bad thing. But when you look at things on a play-by-play basis, like when you look at yards and success and stuff, the Vikings don't jump out at you. If you look at the NFL's yards per play numbers, for example, forget total yards. Total yards are dumb. Let's look at yards per play. Minnesota is 24th on offense and 15th on defense. And that's without any opponent adjusting. So those numbers would suggest a middle-of-the-pack team. If you look at success rate, how often the offense or defense has a successful play by the Football Outsiders standards, they're 24th on offense. Again, 16th on defense. Again, that's without any opponent adjustments. So those numbers would suggest that usually a team that gains yards in, at the amount that the Minnesota does and has success at the rate that Minnesota does is going to be a below average team, slightly below average maybe, not a 7-2 team. The other thing is, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, well, for me, coming from a baseball background, this actually makes a lot of sense. This is like sequencing is in baseball. If you look at last year, the St. Louis Cardinals, maybe if you look at their overall numbers, the individuals don't look like one of the better offensive teams in baseball, but they hit 350 with runners in scoring position this year. That had a lot to do with the fact that they scored a lot of runs, even though that might not have been as predictive going forward. And you're saying the Vikings are kind of the same sort of team where they've just sequenced their events in such a way that they've gotten a lot of points out of a more average type of offensive production line.
Thank you. I forgot what it was called. Sequencing. That is exactly what I am talking about. And yeah, I mean, listen, we analyze football in terms of plays and drives, and DVOA is based solely on plays. But there is something to be said for the idea that drives are put together in such a way that it's not necessarily just random chance. But in general, we have found that, teams that sequence things together as well as Minnesota has, that does not tend to continue. It regresses somewhat, in the future. It's better to be consistent play-by-play, continue to move the ball, constantly put the offense into good down and distance situations, continue to move the chains, move the chains, move the chains, move the chains. The other issue is what we call fumble luck. We talk about that a lot, probably more than sequencing, but it's definitely an issue with the Vikings, and that is that causing fumbles and creating fumbles and fumbling the ball yourself is somewhat random. Turnovers have a much bigger swing of in the span of possibilities, sort of much larger than yardage. But there is some skill to those things. Picking up the ball when it's bouncing on the ground is pretty much entirely luck. And Minnesota has recovered 73% of fumbles so far this year. That's 7 of 10 on offense and 4 of 5 on defense. And that is the second highest rate in the league behind, this is kind of amazing considering how bad they are, San Francisco.
It's a full circle right here.
Oh my golly, which has recovered 75% of fumbles, not counting muffed special teams plays, which are kind of a different item, because muffs are almost always recovered by the return team. Usually it's just you lose the opportunity to return, you don't lose the ball. Sometimes you lose the ball, but usually you don't. Anyway, Minnesota has had great fumble luck, so that's another thing that drags them down. So if we look at them not counting week one and not counting the opponent adjustments, and then we consider we only look at fumbles that they recovered themselves, now they go to 11th. And with a jump from 13th to 11th, like they're 11th, but it's a significant jump. So a lot of what's going on with Minnesota is explained by the schedule, the fumbles, and that week one game. There's also the issues of sequencing. And I do think the numbers point to Green Bay as the better team. Now, whatever Green Bay is struggling with the last 3 weeks, we know, we've always learned to look more long-term. There's no doubt that teams do seem to have figured out how to stop the Green Bay offense without Jordy Nelson, that they somehow couldn't get off the film in the first few weeks. And Rodgers' mechanics don't seem quite right. It reminds me a lot of Tom Brady in the first 4 weeks of last year, where he didn't seem to trust his line or his receivers, and so his footwork wasn't quite the way it is usual, and he was throwing passes that just had no chances of being completed, almost like he was just giving up on things. I don't know what the psychological issues are there. I don't know what's been happening the last 3 weeks, but we've learned over time that these short-term trends tend to be really overblown by the media. If you look at the whole season, Green Bay is the better team. I would not be shocked to see Green Bay lose, especially since the game is in Minnesota this week. But I think that overall, over the whole season, Green Bay is the better team. And Minnesota will lose games in the second half of the year because of their schedule. And that's why we still have Green Bay as the favorite to win the division, although not by a very high amount at this point.
Right, and the Vikings have the advantage in that they're a game up, too, so they don't have to play quite as well. I guess it kind of all depends, too, on how they play against each other. But that's interesting. And it's really interesting with the Vikings because it's kind of like the Vikings are the perfect tutorial of how advanced football stats work or how DVOA is created. You sort of started a team that's super successful, and then all of these various factors that aren't very predictive are sort of going in their favor to an unreasonable extent that'll regress going forward for the rest of the year.
Yeah, although, they're not a very good tutorial if they now go on and finish 12-4 because then they make advanced stats look dumb. But do remember that, first of all, there's always, we're always talking about small sample size with football. The range of possibilities is huge. We never know as much as we think we know. Not only is it possible for a bad team to go 5-2 over the last 7 games, even against a good schedule, just because of randomness. But it's also possible that Minnesota is not as bad as the advanced numbers make them look, right? There's a lot of range of possibilities here. So the idea of Green Bay losing this division is not, completely out of thought. Right now, we have Green Bay wins the division 54% of simulations, Minnesota 45%, Chicago 1.5%. I rounded numbers. That's why that adds up to more than 100. Both Minnesota and Green Bay end up with an average of 10 wins exactly at the end of the season. So the reason why Green Bay wins the division more often is that in more of our simulations, Green Bay wins tiebreakers.
That's really interesting, too. That division is super close, even with what you're saying there. So that'll be fun to watch the rest of the season. Yeah, Aaron, if there's a team that's the opposite of the Vikings, it's probably the Kansas City Chiefs, or it might actually be another team that we'll talk about in a little bit later. But the Chiefs sort of had the opposite problem of the Vikings, which was early in the season, they had just a gauntlet that was very difficult. In fact, they lost 5 straight games between weeks 2 and 6, but according to DVOA at least, that was like a really tough part of their schedule, where 4 of those 5 losses were to the Broncos, the Packers, the Bengals, and the Vikings, who we're now seeing are even better than we probably thought previously. So given that, we were kind of writing off the Chiefs. At the time, the Broncos were undefeated, but now that the Broncos have started to have their problems, Manning is hurt, they've lost a couple of games, the Chiefs have now won 3 straight and are now 4-5 in the season. They just beat the Broncos as well. So my question is, have the Chiefs done enough that it's start to maybe time to consider that maybe the AFC West is potentially theirs up for grabs?
I really doubt it. Brock Osweiler would have to be really horrible for Denver to lose a 3-game lead. And Kansas City has played better than Oakland. Oakland would still be in it too. That's the thing, right? That both Oakland and Kansas City are 4-5. Part of what's interesting here for both the AFC West but more particularly for the wild card is Kansas City and Oakland still play each other twice.
Right.
But it would be really hard to make up that 3-game change. The odds now we have, even though we have Kansas City now as a better team than Denver, we have Denver winning the division in 89% of the simulations. It is really hard to make up 3 games with only 7 left. But in the wild card race, I think Kansas City is in position to be a big part of that race. And the AFC wild card race is a really good race this year, in part because the division winners got out to such huge leads. There are not teams that are sort of division or wild card. It's pretty much that we know New England, Cincinnati, and Denver are going to win those divisions. We know that the chances of an AFC South getting the team getting the wild card are virtually nil. So we can really have a completely separate race now that consists of the Jets, the Bills, the Dolphins, the Chiefs, the Raiders, and the Pittsburgh Steelers. If you believe DVOA, less the Dolphins than those other teams. But still, that is a really good race with a lot of interesting teams, and by our numbers, good teams.
Yes.
I mean, the teams that I mentioned, right? The Jets are currently 7th. Pittsburgh is 6th, and that's incorporating the games that didn't have Roethlisberger. Kansas City is 9th. Buffalo is 10th. Oakland is 13th. That is a really good battle. Only 2 of those teams can make the playoffs unless something crazy happens with one of those 3 division leaders.
Yeah, the great thing for the Chiefs is that, as we mentioned, they do have their 3 total games left against the Bills and the Raiders. So 2 of the teams they're vying for wildcard spots against. And so obviously their fate's in their hands in a lot of respects. But the other great thing, too, is that in addition to those 3 games, their other opponents are more toward the bottom of the league in DVOA. They have to go to the Chargers this week. They're 26th in DVOA. Later on, they play at the Ravens. They're 16th in DVOA. And then they host the Browns in week 16. They're 30th in DVOA. So there's some very winnable games for them outside of the crucial matchups against other wildcard opponents. So again, it's like the opposite of the Vikings, where the Chiefs have a very favorable schedule for them going down the rest of the season with a chance to make the playoffs.
Yes, they are 26th in average remaining opponent, whereas the Jets are 20th, Raiders 19th, Steelers 10th, and Bills 4th. The other thing I really like about Kansas City is that they are a balanced team. I like balanced teams. I feel that, I mean, there's a little bit of research, not much to back this up, to be honest, because if you look at, championships, there's only been 25 of them in the last 25 years. But I like teams that are balanced better than teams that are one-sided. And Kansas City is currently 9th on offense, 12th on defense, and 8th on special teams. So that is a balanced team that can play on all 3 phases and therefore challenge weaknesses of their opponents in all 3 phases. And, there's certain things they can't do, like throw deep ever.
Or try.
But, Alex Smith, still throwing 2-yard passes on every 3rd and 6, as recorded at Football Outsiders every Monday in our new Alex column. The stat we named after Alex Smith. But, Kansas City is a good all-around team. There is a lot of talent. It's going to be a really fascinating wild card race in the AFC. And, I like the Chiefs. I think the Steelers are really in. I think when you look at how good they've been when Roethlisberger is healthy, I think the Steelers have the best shot at all. But I think between the Jets, Bills, Raiders, and Chiefs, that is a heck of a race for the second wild card.
I agree. And I agree with you on the Steelers. I just wasn't expecting their defense to generate so much pass pressure, but they're actually number 1 in the league in sacks plus pressure. Obviously, they still have their bye this week, but they'll still be among the elite teams in that respect. Just something that I didn't expect from them. We all expected the offense to be great, at least as long as Ben Roethlisberger is healthy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you have to give props to the new defensive coordinator, Keith Butler, because that defense had fallen apart the last couple years. They're up to 11th in overall defensive DVOA. He finally got something out of Jarvis Jones, who's been terrible. We already knew that Bud Dupree was going to be good. They're getting better play out of the inside linebackers like Shazier, like defensive linemen like Tuitt. We all know Cam Hayward is good. That Pittsburgh defense is way better than it was last year, and that has carried them through the backup quarterback weeks to where I think Pittsburgh is the team no one wants to see in the playoffs Well, I mean, New England is the team no one wants to see in the
right.
playoffs.
But of the teams you might get earlier in the playoffs if you're one of the better teams.
Right. If you're Cincinnati, you do not want to play Pittsburgh. If you're Denver, you do not want to play Pittsburgh in the first round or the second round. If you're New England, you don't want to play Pittsburgh right now.
True.
Don't want to.
I'm bringing this up a little bit out of the blue, so it's okay if you don't have anything on this, but it seems to me that since Jamal Charles got hurt for the Chiefs, they really haven't suffered at all in the running game. And just by traditional statistics, Charkandrick West has been tremendous. I didn't know if maybe by DYAR, if you've looked at that at all, has he been stepping in and become a very effective back? Did they just they sort of struck gold twice there with that backup pick?
Yeah, well, I mean, I love me some Jamal Charles, but I do think that it shows you that running backs are basically replaceable in every way. I mean, I think the most value from running backs as special players comes from their value, the ones who are really good receivers, like Le'Veon Bell, like Charles, certainly. But if you look at, say, I'm looking right now at the spreadsheet that does the team stats, not the players. So I've got DVOA for the team rather than DYAR for the players.
Right.
But if you look at rush offense for Kansas City, from weeks 1 to 5, they had the number 4 run offense in the league by DVOA. And in weeks 6 through 10, they had the number 2 run offense in the league by DVOA, trailing only the Buffalo Bills. So, things have been better with Charkandrick West. They've actually gone up, although some of that value there where Alex Smith had a couple of really big scrambles a couple of weeks ago. But
60-yarder,
what's more important is they haven't been hurt by Charkandrick West, right?
For
There's
sure.
a little bit of the Bill Simmons Ewing theory going on here. And I'll also point out that if you like the running game, then you really like the AFC wildcard race, because in the last 5 weeks, the top teams in run offense DVOA are Buffalo, Kansas City, Miami, and then a team I'll mention in a moment, and then Pittsburgh. And the team I'll mention in a moment is the next team you want to talk about, and that is the Seattle Seahawks.
Right. And I'll just mention, too, I mean, I'm a Panthers fan. Of course I love to watch good rushing attacks. But, I mean, we saved the Seahawks for last, but they're probably the most interesting team of this bunch. Before we get into it, though, I just want to remind everyone that the Off the Charts Football Podcast is presented to you by FantasyInsiders.com. They are your source for daily fantasy sports content. They believe that accuracy matters, and that shows since they've won the daily fantasy accuracy competition for the last 3 seasons. If you're serious about DFS or want to become serious, go to FantasyInsiders.com for free educational content and premium membership options. All right, Seattle. I think the most interesting thing about this is from a Football Outsiders perspective is that they lost to the Cardinals on Monday night, and then they jumped up to 5th in DVOA. So can you start by explaining exactly how that actually happened?
Yeah, that's kind of weird. If you go to Football Outsiders, I go a bit into sort of how our system comes about. But here's the interesting thing, right? DVOA is based on efficiency of per play. And Seattle was more efficient per play. They got 6.6 yards per play. Arizona had 5.4, and Arizona had more turnovers. So when you put those things together, it does look like Seattle's better. Now, the difference is Seattle ran 52 plays. Arizona ran 84, because Seattle would have, plays where they would get like one bad play, and that was the end of the drive, right? Like a safety on first down.
This is the sequencing thing we talked about with the Vikings.
Right. Or they would get the ball after a sacked fumble, and they one play to a touchdown, so they only had one play, right? So Arizona had these much longer drives. It's not just sequencing, but it's sort of sequencing, but sort of also just number of plays.
Right.
So does that show a weakness in the way that we rate teams and games? Possibly. I think it's more likely that it shows a weakness in how we rate single games than how we rate teams. That it may mean that, there could be a better way to measure who's the better team on a certain day. But the question is, for the long term...
Yeah, that may not even be the goal. Like the thing, right. In my mind, knowing that the Seahawks had more yards per play than the Cardinals would suggest to me that on a neutral field down the line, I might suspect that the Seahawks would be the favored team. And so to me, that's kind of what the goal is here, is to figure out who's better, who we think will win going forward based on what we know now. Right. Here's the thing. The one thing that's not included in that is a lot of the penalties. So I have worked in the past, every couple of years, I work on improving the system, and I work on putting penalties in, and I've never quite gotten it quite right. Part of it because
DVOA is not based on win probability added or even expected points added. It's not based on those things, actually, because the equations that it's based on are trying to sort of figure out what the performance says about a team's sort of platonic ideal of how good they are, whereas EPA and WPA measures tend to be much more influenced by context of like what the score of that game is at the time. But I've never figured out how to get the penalties in quite right, and yet we know that they are important. Offensive penalties tend to correlate to future performance better than defensive, as Seattle gets a lot of offensive penalties. They had 3 offensive holding calls on runs, plus a face mask, so that gave them 4 different 1st and 20 or 1st and 25 situations where we're giving them credit in DVOA for getting out of those situations with good passes and runs, but we're not penalizing them for being in those situations because of the holds. So that is something to look at in the future to improve the system. I do think that is probably a weakness of the system, and that was a problem that they had against Arizona was the penalties, and it's a problem they have all the time.
Sure, but I feel like that's definitely been the case more than just so far this season. And regardless of how the Cardinals game worked out with the numbers, the Seahawks have been a top 10 DVOA team pretty much all year, despite the fact that they've been losing. And so I guess my question is, do you think that DVOA number is right about who they are, and that maybe they are one of the best teams going forward that could maybe make a run, or is there some kind of flaw that maybe we're just not picking up very well in the analytical numbers right now?
I'll be honest. I think these numbers are accurate. If you think of the talent on teams, which teams have the most talent? Isn't Seattle a team that passes the eye test in that area?
I think so, for sure.
The offensive line is terrible, right?
Yes. But, I mean, this is sort of the thing. People have been trying to come up with reasons to explain why the Seahawks haven't been as successful this season. And they look at some of the problems that the Seahawks have this year, but a lot of them are problems they've had in previous years that it hasn't really changed. Like, for instance, this year, the Seahawks have allowed the second most sacks and pressures. That's a lot, obviously. But they allowed the second most last year and the second most in 2013 as well. And again, part of that's about Russell Wilson, and that isn't really here or there. Just the point is, that isn't a change in how the team has been previously. It's just now that they're actually losing games, we're kind of looking for reasons why it's happening.
Right. They're not as good as they've been the last couple of years. That's not
true.
That's
yes.
Absolutely true, right? So they were a top 2 defense the last 3 years in DVOA. This year they're 7th. Their offense was 5th last year. This year it's 11th. The special teams are better. But there's no question they've declined on defense and offense. But what they've declined from the best team in football to a pretty good team, right? It's not that they've declined to an average team. They've declined to a team that's still pretty good, but just has had really awful luck and awful play calling and mistakes and issues with blown coverages late in games. But I don't think that there's an indication that having all those blown fourth quarter leads is going to lead to blown fourth quarter leads constantly down the line. I do think there's a little bit here of the Wyatt Earp effect, where some team was eventually going to blow 5 fourth quarter leads in 9 games. I mean, there's definitely an argument to be made that there are coaching issues in losing those fourth quarter leads, and I think that those are good arguments. But there are also arguments to be made that the team has to be good to consistently get those fourth quarter leads against other good teams. And so I think when you look at the league as a whole, it's really hard to have a lot of teams where you look at and you really say to yourself, based on the eye test, that team is absolutely better than Seattle. And I think the teams that are ahead of them in DVOA are the only teams that pass that eye test right now. New England, Arizona, Cincinnati, and Carolina. Maybe Pittsburgh passes that eye test, but Pittsburgh would be ahead of them in DVOA if you only looked at the games with Roethlisberger. So I mean, the fact is that this year feels mediocre. Everyone feels like a lot of teams are mediocre. And the records bear that out, right? It seems like half the league is 4 and 5. Okay?
Yeah, I mean,
but I think it's a lot of random chance. There's not a big gap between the top 4 and the rest of the league in DVOA. It's just random chance as far as who's won games and lost games and a lot of close games. And Seattle, at its heart, Seattle is still a good team. That doesn't guarantee that they'll win a lot of games, but it does guarantee they're going to be in it for a lot of games. And that's why, I mean, I still think they're major playoff contenders. The odds report still thinks they're major playoff contenders. even if you want to buy that Minnesota is for real and they're 7-2, and obviously they have a chance to win their division, Atlanta is not, and their schedule is easy, but they keep losing games to those easy teams. How hard is it to imagine a situation where Seattle wins 2 more games than Atlanta the rest of the way? It's not that tough.
I agree with pretty much everything you're saying there. I mean, Seattle in a lot of ways is the Pittsburgh of the NFC, in that if they make it, they're the team that you definitely don't want to play. And in my mind, I think you can sort of see this when you're watching the games. Things have happened to them that you can easily identify that are causing them to lose games that aren't necessarily about talent. In the Panthers game that they blew the late fourth quarter lead, there was miscommunication in the secondary that left Olsen open for a touchdown. On the Monday night game versus the Cardinals, Richard Sherman kind of went up to try to make a play on an interception, which was a bad decision that led to a touchdown to Michael Floyd in the end zone. But that wasn't about his lack of talent. It was about decision-making and communication in the secondary. And I think a lot of those things can be fixed in ways that lack of talent can't be fixed as the season moves on. So,
yeah, they need to fix them.
They definitely need to fix them.
Excuse the constantly blown coverages and whatever bad coaching is leading to constantly blown coverages and guys freelancing. I'm not excusing that in any way, but yes, I do think that is more fixable. And I think that Seattle, the talent and how they've played, has shown that they are still one of the top teams in the league, just not as good as they were the last couple of years.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, if you look at bad teams, Seattle is really up there with teams with losing records that are really good teams in DVOA. And so, by the way, is Kansas City.
Okay.
I went back and looked at every team that had played 9 games going back to 1989. Seattle is the 3rd best team after 9 games to have a losing record in that whole time. Kansas City is the 9th best team to have a losing record. Sorry, 8th best team to have a losing record after 9 games in all that time. And what's interesting to me is, in part, is the teams, first of all, of the 10 teams that had a DVOA of 12% or more after 9 games but had a losing record, 3 of them were number 1 the year before. So Seattle means there's now 4 of them that were number 1 the year before. And if you look at a lot of the teams on the list, they're teams that were really good the year before, and then everybody asked these questions about what's wrong with this team, what's wrong with this team. I'll give you some good examples here. The 2008 Packers, the 97 Cowboys, the 91 49ers, and then the teams that were actually number 1 the year before. 99 Broncos, the year after Elway retired.
Right.
The 2004 Chiefs, the year after they'd been 13-3, and they were actually number 1 in DVOA, even though they lost their first playoff game in 2003. And then the team that had the best DVOA ever for a team that had a losing record after 9 games is a team that I can't believe that I didn't think of it before I ran this list. Reminds me so much of the Seahawks. The 2003 Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
Oh, man. It does make sense.
Right?
Yes.
Fabulous defense.
Yep.
That suddenly struggled to win close games. The equivalent, I think, of the Jimmy Graham offensive situation is Keyshawn Johnson's whatever the heck was going on with him that year where he just stopped playing after 10 games. Right? Like, that team was really good, but they lost some close games in some absurd ways. The most famous was the Monday night game, which was Tony Dungy's first game back to Tampa since the Buccaneers had fired him, where Tampa Bay had a 21-0 lead at halftime, gave up 28 points to the Colts in the fourth quarter, and then lost on a field goal in overtime because they got a leverage call against them trying to block a field goal that was missed, and Vanderjagt got a second chance for the Colts and put that through. It was the kind of ridiculous fourth quarter / overtime loss that Seattle keeps having this year. Like, the Bucs had that in 2003 over and over again. Now, here's the bad news for Seattle, is that team played down to its record in the second half of the season.
Yeah. I mean,
like, they didn't turn it around and suddenly, like, they were playing well and the schedule got easier and they started winning games. Like, they started playing poorly, and Keyshawn Johnson quit on the team, or whatever happened there, and then they ended up 7-9, and that's the Seattle nightmare, right? Is that they don't right the ship.
I mean, it's very possible, but I have a lot of faith that the Seahawks are going to turn it around. The only other question that I want to ask you about that before we call this a show is that, Seattle has this reputation for having this huge home field advantage, and at least last year in the playoffs, they were able to take advantage of that in the playoffs. If they come in as a wildcard team and are playing exclusively on the road in the playoffs, if they get there, is that going to dramatically impact their ability to win, like more so than other teams? Because obviously it's harder to win on the road than at home. But do they suffer a bigger drop-off going from home to road than other teams still?
Yeah, I think a little bit. It's not written into our playoff odds simulator. We treat home field advantage the same for all teams. Mm-hmm. And in general, it is. When people talk about how Team X has a big home field advantage, they're almost always wrong, or it's only a temporary thing for a year or two. The Saints are the best example of that. You can find 1 or 2 years where the Saints are ridiculously advantaged at home, but if you try to look over a 4 or 5 year period, you'll never find a period where they actually have a bigger home field advantage than any other team. But if you go back and you look at over a dozen years, and you look at how well teams play at home versus the road, the only teams that seem to actually have a slightly larger home field advantage are Western teams.
Right.
And the one that has the biggest, most consistent one is Seattle. And I think it's less about the stadium and more about the distance that you have to fly to get there, combined with the time zone issues, right? Which,
yes.
Obviously San Francisco and whatever have time zone issues. But it's hard to say, definitely, because here's the thing. The NFC West teams seem to have bigger home field advantages than the AFC West teams, which doesn't quite make sense because Denver's at altitude. San Diego is still on the West Coast. Oakland is still on the West Coast. St. Louis is not on the West Coast. So, it's saying that that's what it is, definitely. But there's no question that Seattle's home field advantage, more than San Francisco or whatever, or Arizona, it stands out. And while that's not programmed into our playoff simulation, I do think you can say, yes, being a wild card is worse for Seattle than any other team. They do seem to have a larger home field advantage. It's probably not as much larger as people think it is, but it does seem to be the one consistently larger home field advantage in the league, and that is a problem for them.
Well, I could talk about this all day, but we've flown through 35 minutes. But I can all but guarantee that we'll be talking about the Seahawks again in the next few weeks. So I think that's going to do it for this episode of the Off the Charts Football Podcast. Remind everyone to check out footballoutsiders.com. Great content there from Aaron and all of the Football Outsiders guys. Check out our sponsor, fantasyinsiders.com, and subscribe to our show on iTunes. Thanks again, Aaron, and then I will talk to you and everyone else next week.